Toby the Mudokon is a character introduced in Oddworld Soulstorm, so naturally this video contains spoilers for that game and its downloadable content.
What if it gets to the spoiler?
Toby is one of the most popular characters ever created in any franchise ever. Everyone loves him, and no one would ever want to see him come to harm. As a result, Oddworld Inhabitants provided more story for the Mudokon, and even let players play as him in the DLC Toby Death Simulator, Toby's Escape, where players are able to watch him die over and over again, watch him make his way to freedom. Starting life as a slave at Rupture Farms, just like Alf and Abe, Toby seems to be quite unique for a Mudokon. There's clearly something very special about him somewhat, as unlike the average Mudokon, Toby seems to possess an extensive knowledge that a filthy Mudokon scumbag like him shouldn't. Most famously, he knows how to drive a train, to most Mud's confusion, despite never having driven one. But even more so, Toby seems to possess intricate information about the technology and facilities of the industrial infrastructure of the Magog Cartel, knowing specific tiny details, even such as what type of tapes are used at communication outposts, stuff that you wouldn't expect someone born into slavery to know all about. Indeed, it seems even the Magog Cartel are aware of Toby's abilities and potentially even wary of him because of that. They keep him on his own far down in the depths of Rupture Farms working the boilers, which is quite impressive that he does that all on his own. I like to think there's two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, the management of Rupture Farms acknowledge how skilled Toby is, and know they can trust him to efficiently run the boilers perfectly well all on his own. Indeed, it seems Toby thrives being isolated, simply focusing on his work, and has proven his skills. But also, I suspect they keep him down there because they're somewhat scared of him due to his knowledge and skills and that kind of thing. He could be quite dangerous to them, and of course in Oddworld Soulstorm it would seem they'd be proved correct, considering without Toby, Abe and Alf wouldn't have been able to successfully hijack and operate the FeeCo Depot train, and likely would have been caught and killed. This all being said though, the cartel didn't exactly have too much to worry about due to Toby's pure naivety. He seems to just follow directions and seems more than content to just remain working on the boilers, being loyal to his bosses. Even the Toby's Escape DLC doesn't really feature him intending to escape, it just kind of happens. For most of it he's primarily just trying to warn management about the massive explosion caused unbeknownst to him by Abe and Bigface, and the destruction going on because of that, which he naturally assumes he somehow caused accidentally. His initial reaction is to find out whatever's wrong and try to fix it, presumably before anyone notices. Despite this general initial loyalty though, it's clear that Toby isn't afraid to do things that are against the interests of those he works for. He mentions that he used to sneak out of the boiler room and go to the shipping area of Rupture Farms, simply to watch for trains, and one time outright stealing a train manual from an office when he was trying to get a better look. It seems though that generally he doesn't do these kind of things to be against the company, and more just does it out of his own passions and interests. In this case, Toby likes trains. Though interestingly, concept art, or a concept render or whatever you might call this image, shows Toby wearing a shirt not with the Rupture Farms logo as he does in the game, but with the symbol of FeeCo Depot instead. Which makes me think that potentially Oddworld Inhabitants were considering having Toby be a worker at FeeCo Depot instead, which would be another way to explain how and why he knows all about trains. Which to me makes me consider that maybe FeeCo Depot was originally going to be seen a lot earlier in the game than it is, and maybe that's where we'd have met him. And maybe that's where Abe and Alf would have stolen a train originally. I'm just speculating of course, just because I find this kind of stuff interesting to consider for some reason. Nevertheless, with the factory under siege and disaster all around him, Toby eventually saves himself and gets out of the farm, where he eventually ends up at Mosaic Lines after being guided by what he calls the Lights, which I assume are the fireflies that guided Abe out of Rupture Farms too. Though Toby calls them little blue flying guys, personally I always remembered the fireflies as being white. So I wonder if that's what they actually are, even though it makes sense considering they also guided Abe out of there, and if so, why? Where did they come from and why did they lead Toby to Mosaic? To me at least, it seemed to be hinting at something. That Toby is particularly special in some way that we haven't yet fully seen. The DLC seemed to suggest that there's way more to him than what we know so far. And not even in just terms of the natural world, but even the industrialists too. Like when Toby's talking about how he was alone down in the boilers and says, I think they kept me down there because, well, and then Alf interrupts him, so we don't know what he was about to say. It just seemed to suggest there's something about him that he's nervous about sharing that even Alf and Abe still don't know. While Toby has many great qualities and seems to possess great attention to detail, ostensive observation skills and an indelible, potentially photographic memory, this is balanced out by other aspects of his personality, namely his immense anxiousness. He seems to be a Mudokon that's very easy to panic. Well, I say that, but then again, I guess we've only seen him being shot at, trapped in an exploding factory and burning alive. All situations where I guess one might say it's fair to panic. So maybe it's unfair to put that attribute on him just based on what we've seen so far. In fact, to be fair to him, in a bad ending he somehow manages to see and extinguish a single spark coming out of the furnace, as though he sees it in slow motion, like in the cutscene. How many people could do that? Add that to another skill on his list, abnormally brilliant hand-eye coordination. Maybe it's related to his ability to contort his face beyond normal proportions. It's no wonder he has such great vision, he can make his eyes massive when he truly wants to. This all being said, I think it's clear that the portrayal Oddworld Inhabitants are going for with Toby is of an immensely anxious and worried and shy individual with great gifts and intelligence. Toby was the first fully animated character that was seen when they showed off Oddworld Soulstorm, and the first thing we see is him panicking. Not to mention a promo image of Toby shows him looking extremely worried, biting his nails. And his design just seems to indicate he's a character that the audience is meant to feel sorry for. He's sort of got a very maybe childlike appearance, I guess. Babyface Toby. He even drinks Soulstorm brew out of a straw like a child. Though then again, maybe he was just being hygienic. After all, who knows where the heck those bottles have been, and you've got muds like Alf just putting his lips all over it. Or beak. Toby was just being sensible by avoiding direct contact with a potential source of germs. Backing up his persona though, in the cutscenes of the game, Toby doesn't really say much, mainly listening attentively, and it takes a lot for him to speak up. Though when he does, it's usually to say something incredibly useful when the situation calls for it. Something that he knows due to his extensive knowledge. Lorne has spoken more about the creation of Toby and what they were trying to do by introducing him as a character. Lorne said, "There's people that I've worked with at times that are, let's say, on the spectrum or autistic. Sometimes those are some of the most brilliant people, and then they have some challenges socially. I wanted to encapsulate that genius, but not in a scientist kind of way. Kind of in a every way, every moment of the day, every man kind of way. You know, ordinary person kind of way. So in the creation of Toby, I wanted to have someone that was more introverted, that was more socially awkward, that was more sensitive, and had something brilliant about them. A bigger brains in the bunch, but not necessarily a person that would normally be celebrated." His rather shy and cautious attitude may be a result of, or at least worsened, due to having spent years alone in the boilers of Rupture Farms, as it's indicated that he didn't interact with pretty much anyone other than the security during his time down there. He apparently never went up to the main sections of the factory, like where Abe and Alf worked, alongside most of the other slaves, and was seemingly not allowed to leave the basement that he resided over, and not meant to be in areas that he didn't work in. The management kept him where he needed to be. As a result, this leaves him completely oblivious to many aspects of Oddworld that are common knowledge. He doesn't know what scrab cakes and paramite pies are made of, somehow despite it literally being in the name. And when he sees the scrabs and paramites in the stockrooms, he instead refers to them by the name of the treats. It's a bit like someone seeing a cow and saying, "Oh hey, how you doing, hamburger?" Speaking of which, I really like how Oddworld Inhabitants used Toby's escape to show all these animals getting free away from the factory. You know, in Abe's Oddysee, we see the slaves all get liberated before the factory is destroyed, but no one ever thinks about the creatures that were in it. Until now, I guess it was just assumed that they all became toasty treats. So I really like that now we see that St. Toby of Assisi let them all go. In the real world, Toby's quite notable as he's pretty much, unless I'm mistaken, the first playable Mudokon other than Abe in the entire Oddworld franchise, I think, which I'd say is quite a big distinction. Well, he's tied with the nameless standard Mudokon you get to play as in the FeeCo Labs Challenge Rooms DLC that came out the same day as Toby's escape. In the main game though, Toby plays a relatively small but important role in Oddworld Soulstorm. He's a character that somewhat progresses the story forwards due to the knowledge that he possesses, helping to guide Abe on what to do next and how to figure out their problems, like when he suggests going to FeeCo Depot to get the ingredients to make the cure for Soulstorm brew addiction en masse. Although Toby plays a quieter role than Alf, his role in the story is probably just as important, or arguably even more important than Alf's in Soulstorm. Speaking of Alf, for some reason I find this scene here funny where Alf just stops what he's doing for a moment and smiles while looking at Toby working like a proud dad or something. It looks like he's like, "That's my boy." It's pretty noticeable as well that Toby appears to be, I guess, the base look of the standard Mudokons as of Soulstorm 2. Of course, they went through quite a redesign with this game, with the idea being that in the past, the Mudokons were all basically just clones of Abe, and Oddworld Inhabitants wanted them to be more distinct from each other than that. So now they all look like Toby. Or maybe Toby looks like a typical Mudokon. Either way, it's Toby's clothes that make him stand out from the usual member of his species, or mainly just the fact that he wears his hat backwards instead of forwards, like the cool dude he is. Oddworld Inhabitants added this feature of his outfit to show that despite him wearing a shirt, having that sort of more formal and introverted look for a Mudokon, there is a quietly non-conformist nature about him. Although Toby is a new addition to Oddworld introduced with Soulstorm, his voice sounds very familiar to me.
Well, not at all, actually. I work down in the basement, working the boilers.
And if we look at the Exoddus Soulstorm split as being like alternative universes, I'm sure I've heard this particular voice, or one just like it in the Exoddus universe. So who knows, I guess we could imagine that Toby was there too, as one of the nameless background Mudokons. Overall, Toby is an intriguing character in Oddworld, whom I suspect will take greater precedence in future installments. After playing Toby's Escape, I definitely feel like there's a lot more to him that we haven't seen yet, a far greater importance. Like there seems to be a secret to him or something. Of course, I could just be pareidolianing. I couldn't think of the right word I was thinking of, so looked up what I meant, and apparently that basically means seeing things that aren't there. But either way, it'll be interesting to see what part Toby plays in the rest of the Oddworld quintology.
Hello, follow me.